Hi, I'm Rob Malenka, a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University and a member of the One Mind Scientific Advisory Board. And it's my pleasure this morning to be here in beautiful Napa Valley with the 2024 One Mind Bristol Myers Squibb Rising Star Award, Talia Lerner. Congratulations, Talia, on this very prestigious honor. As you may know, we had a lot of applications, and your proposal rose to the top. So why don't we start by, where are you now and what are you doing?
So thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. And yeah, currently I am an associate professor of neuroscience and psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Northwestern University in Chicago.
You've had this long-standing interest in this neuromodulator chemical messenger dopamine, which is involved in lots of different very important brain functions, motor behavior, how we determine whether something is rewarding, reinforcing. I want to jump to some of the work and topics you're interested in that are really directly related, or even the topic of your proposal that for which you received the Rising Star Award. So tell us about that. I think you started looking at how stress influences this very important system in the brain.
Yes. So stress was a really important part of what I wanted to study in my lab. And it's because stress is such an important risk factor for mental health disorders.
Okay.
And it came from a place also of wanting to understand how dopamine controls learning. But there's a lot of data suggesting that stress changes how we learn. And so what I wanted to do was try to observe dopamine circuits in animals as they learn. One important thing about stress is that it matters when and how you give it. There's not one kind of stress. And we're really interested in how stress impacts circuits depending on developmental timing. This is an active area of research in my lab. We do sort of early life stress, we do adolescent stress, and then we're interested as well in what happens when you experience stress as an adult. And all of those things are different. And the One Mind proposal actually focuses on adult stress, but it focuses on understanding how stress hormones that get released in response to stressful events impact dopamine function, which I think is actually an area where we don't know enough. And unfortunately, we don't have depression treatments that actually take advantage of our knowledge of biological stress responses. So I think that there's an opportunity to understand how dopamine and stress hormones interact with each other in order to treat these disorders. The connection between stress and depression is actually very well supported if you're exposed to chronic stress, especially sort of unpredictable stress that leads to a feeling of things being out of control. It can precipitate depression. And that, again, that's something well supported by data. And I think that's also fairly intuitive.
Right.
If you've ever been through a stressful period in your life, it's easy to get those feelings where there's a loss of hope that can impact how you perceive the world. And I want to understand that. I want to understand why that is and how you can sort of push back against those feelings to take back control and figure out how to deal with stress.
And I would imagine if your research is successful, which I'm sure it will be, that understanding should and could have major impact on the types of treatments we might want to develop for depression. Because while we have good treatments, there's still a lot of individuals suffering that we're not able to help as much as we could. And is that a motivation for the work you're doing in your project that you're receiving the Rising Star Award for?
Yes, absolutely. A big motivation of the project is to find better treatments for depression. We do have kind of widely used treatments, drugs that people have probably heard of, like Prozac and Lexapro and Wellbutrin. They can help for sure. But patients often have to try several of these drugs. They take a long time to work. And in the meantime, people's lives are at risk, especially those with suicidal ideations. And so if we can find faster ways to help people, both faster acting drugs and faster ways to match patients with the right drug, perhaps by understanding things like hormone profiles, then I think that that will provide a lot of relief for patients and their families.
So you were saying when your subjects in your experiments get stressed or we get stressed, there are hormones that change. What are those called, and how do you think they influence this very important dopamine circuitry or parts of the brain that respond to dopamine?
So when you're stressed, your adrenal glands, which are just above your kidneys, release these stress hormones called glucocorticoids. And the major one used by the human body that people have probably heard of is cortisol. And so cortisol is great. It can reduce inflammation. It can help coordinate the fight or flight response that helps us deal with threats in our environment. So there's a reason to have it. But when it's chronically and kind of inappropriately activated, that's when it can start to cause problems like depression. And we want to understand more about how the glucocorticoid receptor signaling impacts dopamine function. So what we're doing in the One Mind proposal is we're manipulating these glucocorticoid receptors that are expressed by dopamine neurons and seeing how that affects dopamine neuron gene expression and function during behavior and susceptibility to chronic stress.
That sounds really cool. And you're using all these modern tools that you learned how to use when you were at Stanford.
Yes.
And you're using genetics and optogenetics, is that right?
Yes, we are trying to make use of all of these new circuit tools, which people have invented. A key one for this proposal is called CRISPR, which is a gene editing technique that won the Nobel Prize. And it allows us to very precisely change a gene in the genome. And we can do it only in a specific cell type, which is really key. So we can manipulate the glucocorticoid receptor, but only in dopamine neurons, and leave glucocorticoid receptors that are in other cell types all over your brain and body completely intact. So we can really do this precise manipulation.
So another part of your, and this is, now we're going to get even more complicated, because I think part of your proposal, and I think intuitively we all know this, is that people respond to stress differently. Some people are highly susceptible, some are not probably. And the sexes, men and women, males and females, sometimes respond very differently. And what's known about that, and how are you gonna be studying those kinds of topics?
Yeah, I'm very interested in studying sex differences in stress susceptibility, especially when it comes to the dopamine system. I think it's an important thing to understand, and that was really highlighted to me. My lab published a paper last year in 2023 where we found that dysregulating stress hormones in male and female mice impaired dopamine transmission in both the males and the females, but that it did so by different mechanisms. And so that really highlighted to me that if you wanted to treat the dopamine dysfunction, if it's happening by different mechanisms in different individuals, then you may need to kind of tailor the treatment. And it set me down this path of really wanting to make sure that we account for sex differences. It's something that hasn't been done that well in sort of historical studies. A lot of times female subjects have been excluded. And if we only understand male physiology, we're not going to treat female physiology appropriately. And there's a lot of reason to believe that hormonal changes are very important for depression. Especially for women, you know, there are these periods of large changes in hormones that correlate with periods of susceptibility to depression. So like puberty, pregnancy, and postpartum and menopause are all times when women are particularly susceptible to depression. And there's a connection there that I think we really need to understand.
No, I think that's incredibly important. But this gets into a topic that, you know, we read about in the lay press that's often confusing. I mean, are men and women's brains different? And is the dopamine system that you've been studying, what now, for 15 years, are they different? Are they dramatically different? Are they a little bit different? Do we know anything about that? What do you think?
I think the key is not to think of sex differences as sexual dichotomies. That's much too extreme. what we see is a lot of individual variability that can be kind of biased one way or the other by sex, by hormone signaling. But there's large amounts of variability within both sexes. There's overlapping spectrums. There's lots of commonalities in how the dopamine system functions,
Right.
but there's also differences. And so just appreciating the nuances is important. And even appreciating, kind of like I was saying, there are changes over the lifetime of one individual as you go from puberty to pregnancy to menopause, right? And so I think of it more as tailoring treatments for individuals and
Right.
appreciating that sex and gender for humans is a part of that individuality.
Beautifully said, quite eloquent how you just described that. Do we know anything about why some individuals, and I don't know if this happens in your mice, are just from early on very susceptible to stress and perhaps stress-elicited mood disorders like depression, and why some individuals just can experience stress, can actually experience tragedies, and seem to be able to bounce back and handle that without getting severely depressed? Or is that still a wide open topic for exploration?
Yeah, the question of why different individuals respond differently to stress is fascinating and I think also important. It's a goal of my research to use that individual variability to really understand how circuits work. And it's something that I'm not alone in studying. For example, Eric Nestler, who's on the One Mind Scientific Advisory Board as well, has done really amazing work in this area looking at genes that may change susceptibility. So there's a lot of leads that I think are interesting and something that will be important to follow up on. And one thing I've thought a lot about is, we want to understand susceptibility to stress. We also want to understand that resilience. Some individuals go through terrible things in their lives and really come through admirably. And perhaps if we can understand resilient individuals, we can also understand, that's what we're aiming for, is how to make people resilient. So I think understanding this just spectrums of behavior in both directions is really powerful for understanding the kind of range of circuit function that can occur in the brain. And again, getting back to synaptic plasticity, changes in the brain, how can we kind of sculpt the brain towards resilience?
10 or 20 years from now, what do you hope to have achieved, and what do you hope its impact on mental health will actually be?
Yeah, I'm a basic neuroscientist, so I do very curiosity-driven research.
Right.
I'm really interested in just basic questions about how neural circuits function, but I really hope to do that research in a way that's thoughtful about what needs to happen to translate these discoveries into treatments for patients. And so I really very much hope that in 10 or 20 years, we find threads of our basic research that can be turned into ideas for therapies. And I'll have to see where that takes me, but I really want to look for the opportunity to find things that can be taken by translational scientists and by clinicians and turned into therapies. And if I can help any person with depression or another mood disorder in the future, I feel like it will have served a purpose and done right by my family and improved the world. And that's really what I hope to do.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you. I learned so much, and I'm sure our audience learned a lot. I also want to thank One Mind for this opportunity of interviewing this brilliant young scientist and for all of their support in supporting research on mental health and delivery of the best mental health care possible.
Thank you. Thanks so much to One Mind for this support, and I'm really looking forward to being part of the One Mind Network.